To sum up, in patients who have very low pretest probability, that is less than 15%, we do not go for an angiography. If you have more than 85% pretest probability, we directly go for an angiography. Between 15 to 85%, you need to do what are called non-invasive tests. And if the non-invasive tests are indicative of ischemia, then we go ahead and do an angiography, right? So let's go on from there. Okay, so let's have a look at the various non-invasive modalities of testing that are available to us in chronic stable angina. As you can see, there is a long list of non-invasive testing, but what most of you will be familiar with is the one on the top, which is exercise stress testing in the form of treadmill test. I'll come to the others, but first up, the concept of exercise stress testing is that as the person exerts, the demand increases and the supply becomes inadequate. This demand supply mismatch will precipitate ischemia and ECG changes, right? So with that principle, let's see you do that by making the patient run on a treadmill. I have attached a link to a YouTube video in the show notes below. So when you have a look at the show notes, please look at this link on how the treadmill test is being done. So as you can see, there is a gentleman who will be the patient who will be running on a treadmill, and his blood pressure as well as ECG will be monitored by a trained observer. And while this is being done, right, we will be looking at his exertion through a whole series of a range of exertion. So this series, this predefined strategy of increasing workload is what we call the Bruce protocol. You can see that the Bruce protocol is divided into 1 to 7 stages on the left side, and as you can see from the left side, each stage lasts for about 3 minutes, and in each stage there is an increase in the speed as well as the gradient of the incline. So what it does is that each stage the patient will have to put in greater and greater exertion. This exertion is measured as METs, or metabolic equivalence, which you are seeing on the right side. This is so that we have a standardized way of testing all the patients, right? So, when the patient exercises as per the Bruce protocol, the greater the exertion, the greater the chances of ischemia. So, even hidden ischemia will then be manifest. The first sign of ischemia that we will be seeing is ST depression, because it's subendocardial ischemia that we are looking for. So, when the patient is undergoing yes, this is what we usually take as a positive test. Sorry. If the patient is showing greater than 1 millimeter of ST depression before stage 2, or 2 millimeter ST depression at any stage, it is considered as a positive treadmill test. Now, when there is ST depression, it can be of various types. Okay, the various patterns, we call it all these three. As you can see, there is a normal ECG on your left side, and on the right side you can see three abnormal ECG patterns, all having ST depression. However, the first one, the one on top, has what is called an upsloping ST depression. The middle one has a horizontal ST depression, and the lower one has a downsloping ST depression. Horizontal and downsloping ST depression, that is the ones in red, are highly specific for ischemia. So if the patient is having ST depression less more than 1 millimeter in the first two stages, or more than 2 millimeter ST depression during any of these stages, along with downsloping or horizontal pattern, very high chance that you are dealing with ischemia. In such patients, you should go ahead with an angiography. Other reasons to terminate the testing is if the patient develops hypotension, systolic blood pressure falling by more than 10 millimeters. This is because there is ischemia and the cardiac contractility goes down. So if you're having a systolic blood pressure fall, or the ST depression remains for more than 5 minutes after exercise, all of these are indicative of a positive treadmill test. If you have a positive treadmill test, you should then go ahead and do an angiography in this patient. This is very simple to understand how a treadmill test works. Now, Even though the treadmill test is very easy to understand, we would also want to look at some of the other modalities of non-invasive testing. Coming back to that, exercise stress testing can sometimes also be done by using echocardiography. Right? We can also see echocardiography. When the person exerts, the demand increases to the heart, and when the demand increases to the heart, the supply cannot be increased because of ischemia, and then the cardiac contractility reduces, so the heart is not emptying completely. So this way you can also use echocardiography to see if the patient's is having ischemia. Along with echocardiography, suppose your patient is unable to exercise, he is unable to run, say he has an older patient with arthritis of the knee, you can also do an increase in the cardiac contractility by using certain chemicals like inotropes. You can use medicines like dobutamine. What dobutamine would do is increase the contractility of the heart, and that increases the demand. Because of the demand supply mismatch, there can be reduced contractility or ischemia at some parts of the heart. So you can do this by doing something called an exercise stress echo or a dobutamine stress echo. Now, the principles of a dobutamine stress echo, again, I have attached a YouTube link for you to have a look at. So, what is done over here is when you do an echo and you are injecting dobutamine, you're forcing the heart to contract harder and harder. When the heart contracts harder and harder, if it is not getting adequate amount of blood, the muscle will then develop ischemia and transiently stop contracting. So ischemic muscle will not contract. When that does not contract, you will see that the emptying of the ventricle becomes lesser and lesser, or the ventricle does not contract very well when you inject dobutamine. So in a normal condition, patient's ventricle seems to be emptying properly, but as you inject dobutamine, you will see that the contraction is not proper, right? So this is what we call a stress echo or a dobutamine stress echo. You could even do an exercise stress echo. You will see that the ischemic wall, whichever wall is not receiving adequate blood, that wall does not contract properly, or there is a motion abnormality. We call these regional wall motion abnormalities, which is very indicative of ischemic heart disease. For example, if the LAD is partially obstructed and you inject dobutamine, you will see that the anterior wall is not contracting very well. Okay, I would ask you to have a look at that video to understand a little more in detail about how exercise stress echo works. Another interesting thing that has evolved recently is what we call CT coronary angiography. CT coronary angiography has developed because of much better computing power that is available today, and we are able to get very thin slices in the CT, and we are able to delineate even the coronary vessels, as you can see over here. Now, the coronary vessels, if it is having atherosclerosis, it will also have calcium deposits in it. And using CT, you can actually score how much calcium you have. This is what we call a coronary calcium score, or CCS. The unit for this is called an Agatston unit. And as you can see in the table, you have something called an Agatston score. So you have scores from 0 all the way till 400. Usually, if the Agatston score is more than 400, there is a very good chance of having atherosclerotic disease. If the Agatston score is less than 400, you need not do an angiography. So this is how we use non-invasive testing to decide on whether you need to go for an angiography or not. The last type of non-invasive test that we should be aware of is something called radionucleotide scintigraphy or stress thallium. We do this by injecting radioactive thallium or technetium. Thallium is preferred. So when you inject radioactive thallium, it is picked up by those myocardial cells which are highly active. So here you can see that when the thallium is picked up and there is ischemia or there is decreased blood supply to one part of the heart, that part shows appears a little cold. I'll show you an example here. This is taken from your Harrison's textbook of internal medicine. So here you can see that when thallium is injected, you can see an image of the left ventricle. The first panel will show you that there is anterior, lateral, septal, and inferior walls, and you can that is basically a transverse cut, and similarly you can see a horizontal, a sagittal cut, which is again showing you anterior apex and inferior walls. So at rest, the left ventricle seems to take up the thallium uniformly, but during exertion, note what happens during exertion. So during exertion, this could be even dobutamine, or after the patient exerts a little and then lies down, you can see that the thallium is not picked up by the anterior wall. This is because during in exertion, there is not enough blood going to the ischemic anterior wall. So this is the suggestion that the patient has an LAD territory ischemia. Similarly, I'll show you one more example. Here is the same sections. You can see a horizontal as well as a sagittal section, and at rest the uptake of thallium is uniform, but during exertion you can see that the posterior or the inferior wall seems to take up less amount of thallium. This means, which artery do you think is blocked? Yes, it is a right coronary artery can be ischemic. So this is how you use thallium to identify. Okay, so this is about your various types of non-invasive testing for chronic stable angina in patients who are having 15 to 85% probability of having ischemic heart disease. You first do non-invasive testing. Either, most commonly we do a TMT. You can also do a stress dobutamine or exercise echo. You can also use coronary CT angiography and calculate the coronary calcium score. The last thing that is available is myocardial perfusion scans, or thallium, stress thallium, as we call it, right? So let me get out from there. Okay. So here is so that completes our discussion on non-invasive imaging of chronic stable angina, and finally we come to the management of chronic stable angina, right? Okay, so now that you're sure that your patient has chronic stable angina, the question is, what are the drugs that you're going to give this patient? You're already quite aware of the algorithm. Okay, low risk, no need for angiography. High risk, go for angiography. Intermediate risk, you do non-invasive testing. If that is positive, go for the angiography, right? We do angiography in all patients who have, right? So I think here we will have those indications for angiography: those who are having chronic stable angina with high pretest probability or moderate pretest probability and a non-invasive testing positive, right? Other reasons to do an angiography can be if the patient has symptomatic chronic stable angina and despite OMT, that is optimal medical therapy, you are not getting relief and you want to plan for an angioplasty. If you're planning for an angioplasty, of course you need an angiography before that. Lastly, if the patient has developed a cardiac arrest and the patient has a history of chronic stable angina, if the patient has an echocardiographic finding of left ventricular dysfunction, that is heart failure, then again we need to go for angiography, because that heart failure could be due to ischemia. And finally, any patient who is requiring another surgery can also undergo an angiography, right? So in chronic stable angina, these are the indications of for angiography, and you shall see these in the show notes so you can read it from that itself. Okay, right. So now we move on from there into the management of ischemic heart disease. So we have the indications for angiography, you know, the diagnostic algorithm, yes. And finally, sorry about it, yeah, here we shall move towards the management of ischemic heart disease. So once your angiography confirms an ischemic heart disease, the first thing that we advise the patient is lifestyle modification and drug therapy, right? If these don't work, usually we go for revascularization. Of course, in high risk or those patients who are intermediate risk with non-invasive testing positive, we should go for attempt at an angiography first. So, about lifestyle modifications and optimal medical therapy. Okay, first let's discuss what are the lifestyle modifications. Classic lifestyle modifications include smoking cessation, exercise as permitted. I would want you to have a look at table 267.3 in the 20th edition of Harrison, because it gives you what exercises can be done by a patient of ischemic heart disease. Each patient having chronic stable angina can do a certain amount of exertion, and that depends upon how many mets he is putting in. So even while we are doing a treadmill test, we will get an idea that this patient can do so many metabolic equivalents of work. So we can say that you can do such and such work at home, but not some others. Okay, right. Dietary modifications to reduce calorific intake is also something that we advise the patients. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So here we were with lifestyle modifications that we used to do in these patients. And then we come to what is called optimal medical therapy. Okay. Optimal medical therapy has to work on three major factors. One is to reduce risk factors of ischemic heart disease. You know that there are various risk factors like diabetes, hypertension. You need to control that. The second aspect is you need to give drugs to reduce the risk of heart failure and also to reduce the risk of development of an acute coronary syndrome. The third is to provide symptomatic relief. So let's see which are the drugs we use for each condition. In order to manage the risk factors, yes, hypertension, diabetes, you know the drugs already. I'm not going into the depths. We will discuss this in detail in our hypertension and diabetes chapter. And in dyslipidemia, you know that statins are a major group of drugs that we use for it. We have also fibric acid derivatives and niacin. I also want you to know that there is a new group of drugs which are monoclonal antibodies to, okay, PCSK9, right? PCSK9. This is monoclonal antibodies to PCSK9, which are given as subcutaneous injections. Okay, so you have alirocumab and evolocumab, which are available as injections. These are the newest drugs which are used in the control of dyslipidemia. Right. So these are the drugs that we use for managing the risk factors in these patients. So drug therapy can be aimed at risk factor management, or it can be aimed at reducing the risk of acute coronary syndrome. That is basically by giving aspirin, low dose aspirin, and also preventing heart failure. We'll discuss this in our heart failure sessions, that there are certain drugs that help in preventing remodeling of the heart and development of heart failure. These include ACE inhibitors, ARBs, and beta blockers. So, in a patient who we are expecting to manage for chronic stable angina, we will prefer to use ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, or ARBs because they also prevent heart failure. This is not the case with other antihypertensives like calcium channel blockers. So we would prefer these drugs over calcium channel blockers. Okay, right. In the relief of angina, there are many drugs that are classically used. I think the most common, which all of you will be aware of, are nitrates, which are short acting nitroglycerin or longer acting isosorbide or isosorbide dinitrate or mononitrate. There are those that reduce the heart rate, like beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, or even ivabradine, a funny channel inhibitor. There are newer drugs like ranolazine, nicorandil, and trimetazidine. These will be available in your show notes. You can see that ranolazine inhibits sodium entry and prevents calcium load. Nicorandil basically opens the ATP sensitive potassium channels, and that reduces intracellular calcium, while trimetazidine basically reduces the metabolic demand by interfering with fatty acid metabolism. Now, all of these drugs you will find in your show notes, and these are the drugs that we use to reduce angina. So there are certain drugs that we are going to use to modify risk factors, certain drugs to prevent heart failure and acute coronary syndromes. Some others like this are purely symptomatic to reduce angina. You need to give all of this to the patient, right? So you will see a patient who is getting his blood pressure, his diabetes, his cholesterol controlled. Along with that angina relief, you will be seeing a patient getting these drugs, and along with that you will also see the other lifestyle modifications and dietary modifications. This is what we commonly offer to all patients who have ischemic heart disease, chronic stable angina. Now, in which of the patients who we would want to do a revascularization? Okay, so once you do an angiography, once you see that the patient seems to have a block, we need to do a revascularization procedure, right? A revascularization procedure would be either a coronary artery bypass graft, which is a CABG, or a percutaneous coronary intervention, PCI, that is stenting that you had seen in STEMI. In case of chronic stable angina, we prefer to do a coronary artery bypass graft. The reason we prefer to do a CABG is because the CABG is the more preferred, especially in case of left main coronary artery. It's a very difficult part to stent. If you have multiple blocks and multiple vessels that are involved, then it's always preferable to do a CABG because you can bypass multiple blocks. The left ventricular dysfunction, if is present, it is always preferable to do a CABG rather than do a PCI, which can get blocked again. If the patient has severe symptoms, you can always prefer a CABG. Okay, and if the patient is having a more severe disease, we always prefer a CABG. Now, I have this table which delineates the difference between a PCI and a CABG. As you can see in the first row, CABG is preferred if you have multiple vessel diseases, if the anatomy is complicated, especially left main coronary, and if you are having heart failure, that is a reduced ejection fraction. CABG is a more complex procedure. You can see that during the procedure itself, there is a higher chance of death, 1.5%, and there is also a chance of 10% chance of having myocardial infarction during the procedure, or even ischemic stroke or memory loss. This is because CABG is done mostly with using a heart lung bypass. So you might have to stop the heart. Okay, of course, there is also a CBG that can be done on a beating heart. There is a YouTube video attached which you can have a look at to see the difference between these various types of CABG. But in general, you can see CABG, look at the second, third, and fourth rows, you will see that the complications of CABG, that is the procedure, the surgery per se, is much more than the PCI. CABG also has longer hospital stays and takes longer for the patient to get back to work, as you can see in the remaining two columns. If you look at the last two columns, you will see why CABG is preferred. CABG is preferred in chronic stable angina because chances of it getting blocked again is much lesser, and the need for a repeat procedure is also much lesser. So if you look at this, what you can understand is between coronary artery bypass grafting, between coronary artery bypass grafting and percutaneous coronary interventions, we prefer CABG, especially if the patient is having complicated anatomy, multiple blocks. If the patient has poor prognosis or heart failure, we would always prefer to do a CABG. The advantage of PCI is that is percutaneous coronary intervention is it is usually done in more trivial blocks, and the patient can get back to living a normal life pretty quickly.